Highways were and still are strategic projects for the Central European countries, just like any other infrastructure. We already talked about highway tunnels, but let's focus on the entire highway networks today. How were highway projects continued after the fall of communism? What were the plans and overall background? What was built around the highways? Let's explore all that, while down here in our city, let's continue our highway system by finally completing the urban highway on the second end with gas stations, stop, interchange, a tunnel, and on the other side of the city, let's start the very first part of the city's highway ring. I already lightly introduced the entire highway situation while building the city tunnel previously, but let's now go into some more details. The change of political leadership did not change much the highway plans that were created going back decades, with some projects even into the earlier 20th century. We already talked about the pre-war German highways, which were then partially inherited by new Polish regions, plus some war-built segments in Czechoslovakia. Although majority of the modern quotation marks projects were the product of the 50s and 60s, with some starting even back then. By 1989, vast majority of those plans remained unfinished. Let's take a look at the 1989 map of existing highways. One thing that you probably noticed right away is the extensive highway system in East Germany. It was significantly more extensive compared to the rest of the Eastern Bloc, with some close to 1900 kilometers. Although most of that were the old pre-war highways that were mostly left in exactly the same conditions. Communist Germany only built small new segments and refurbished a few others. What is also unique for East German highway network is that it was connected to West Germany in a few places, and interestingly, West Germany even paid for some of the newly built highways of its eastern neighbor. Just to have a little more context, West Germany at this point had around 9,000 kilometers. West Germany was around 4 times larger population-wise, so East German highway network length wasn't that crazily behind. But the other communist countries certainly were. On the other side of the spectrum was Poland, where by 1989 there were only 381 kilometers of highways and expressways, not forming any connected system apart from the so-called Silesian highway, but that was inherited from Germany after the war, although it was somewhat upgraded over the decades. Czechoslovakia managed to build its main highway connecting Prague and Bratislava, plus some other shorter segments here and there, with total length of 336 kilometers for Czechia and 183 kilometers for Slovakia. Hungary was also very far behind its initial plans for extensive highway network, finishing only some segments radiating from Budapest, its capital, with a total length of some 340 kilometers. These numbers especially put into perspective the very slow highway building in Poland, considering Poland's size. But in the future, as we will reach the European Union era, things would drastically change in Poland. Another thing back then was the lukewarm approach to infrastructure crossing borders, apart from connections between the two Germanys, although those already existed before the Germanies split. This is probably related to the trading reality between socialist countries, as we explored it some time ago in the series in episode 82, plus the more restricted movements of the populations. To complete the background for highways before 1989, we must not forget that railway cargo transport was very important in the communist countries. Once again, I will repeat that German statistic that at some point East German railways transported double the amount of cargo compared to West Germany, despite the West having double the railway length. Another thing was car ownership, which was drastically lower in the Eastern Bloc. There was also the planned nature of housing and industry expansion, basically building very large industry and housing somewhat together, hugely growing cities, drawing people from the countryside, thus not creating need for the modern car commuting as we see it today. It's a huge simplification of the whole planned process, of course. Not every place was expanded equally, not everyone had to live in these expansions, not everyone commuted by public transport, but it's just the general average situation. Let's just quickly recap the numbers of cars in the region, which I already talked about all the way back in episode 66. But here in this simple table, there are just car numbers in millions in 1990 and then 2000 with a percentage increase. East Germany, of course, is counted as the region of unified Germany and Czechoslovakia as sum of both newly split countries. Let's now switch to numbers of cars per citizen to better reflect countries' sizes. The United States is only small personal cars. The entire personal truck situation there is apparently statistically very complicated or something. Contrary to a popular belief that car ownership absolutely skyrocketed in the 90s, it wasn't really that crazy. Well, depending on how you measure it, I guess, because Poland is certainly closest to that idea, since in the 90s car numbers basically doubled, almost. Surprisingly, East Germany also significantly increased its car numbers, despite already having the most cars in Eastern Bloc before 1989. Czechoslovakia then almost linearly continued its car trend of the previous decade, while Hungary actually somewhat slowed down in the car increase compared to the 80s. So that was the background. Let's now talk about the 90s. How were the highway projects continued? Well, painfully. Just like in the previous decades, though. By changing leaderships in 1989, countries of course did not magically spawn money. On the contrary, state finances were struggling during the transition. Poland was fighting hyperinflation for the first initial years, dealing with massive foreign debt and overall consequences of its 1980s economic crisis. East German finances were practically gone, relying on Western funds. Czechoslovakia and Hungary were doing a little better, but struggled nonetheless. It might have been logical for the countries to somehow wait it out, stabilize before engaging in big projects again, but at the same time, the countries were behind the West in all sorts of areas, not just infrastructure, so painful investments must have been made as fast as possible to bear fruit in the future. Highway construction became a very political topic. That continues practically unchanged to this day, but it kind of started back then. How many kilometers of highways a government opens is basically its measure of success. How well are we catching up with the West? How well are we fixing the embarrassing state of things from before? So let's take a look at the countries individually. Former East Germany was again and again different compared to its former comrades. West Germany took over and poured big money into the region. One essential part of the 90s highway work there was to rebuild the existing highways to modern standards, which was a huge task because of the existing large network. Another task was to cross-connect East and West together much better than during the Cold War. Those were the so-called German Unity Transport projects. This program actually mostly involved railways. Highways were planned to be roughly 40% of the program's budget, and some parts are still under construction today. It is a bold program, to say the least, as its total budget is nearly 40 billion euros, and its highway part either widens or builds anew close to 1900 kilometers, so practically the same length as the pre-existing pre-unification network. Although in the 90s, work did not go exactly as fast as planned. This is a map showing new opened highways before 1999. I did not find separate statistics anymore, only for the entire Germany, and the highways there increased by 618 kilometers. Poland struggled to build more and opened 121 kilometers, which actually also includes some kilometers of just finished separate opposite directions. The number also includes a lot of expressways, which are almost highways but smaller, cheaper. Interestingly, because Poland struggled to find state money, it started signing the so-called public-private partnership deals, or triple P projects. In practice, it would mean that a private company would be tasked with designing, building, operating, and maintaining a highway while collecting toll for itself, and after a given time period, a couple of decades, it would give that highway to the state. Although the deals could also have different arrangements, it really depends. The first such highway in Poland, and most likely in the entire region, was a short segment between Katowice and Kraków, where a private company obtained a license to turn that part into a proper modern highway and maintain it for 30 years. Czechia then added some 113 kilometers, mostly by heavily focusing on the Prague-Pilsen-Nuremberg highway, because suddenly borders opened, trade with the West would be crucial, so these kinds of connections suddenly became very strategic. Just like the Prague-Dresden highway, which also saw some progress in the 90s. Slovakia added 71 kilometers, which actually seems like a lot given its size, although more than half of that were only halves. So one directions temporarily split between two directions, so one lane each. Temporarily is a little funny word at this point, since some segments are still like that today, including the longest Slovakian highway tunnel. But once again, focus was heavily on the western part of the country, around the capital, Bratislava, where Slovakia has its only short border with the Western world into Austria. And then there was Hungary with its 191 kilometers of new highways, surprise, surprise, finishing the highway west-northwest into Austria and Slovakia, which almost completed the crucial east-west highway corridor into Germany through Czechia, making the Czech-Prague-Brno highway one of the most important truck connections in Central Europe, unfortunately for Czech drivers. Hungarians also completed the very first parts of a highway ring around Budapest. Architecture is also tied to the highway building of the 1990s. Like we explored before, the suddenly very free economy created big gaps for all sorts of businesses, and highways are good places for a lot of them. So more gas pumps, shops, restaurants, hotels, casinos, clubs, those kinds of things. So many such buildings opened around big roads in the region, kind of capturing the idea of wild 90s very well, with their architecture, but also with their eventual fate, because a lot of these places only operated for a couple of years before closing down, and the buildings are either gone, abandoned, or rebuilt into something else. So that was the situation with highways in Central Europe of the 1990s. This topic once again showed the total disconnect of former East Germany, which became the West so much more than the other countries further east. Countries financially struggled, although at the same time needed the infrastructure if they ever planned on catching up with the West. So eventually the highway construction continued rather normally, despite the sometimes common belief that after the fall of communism, practically nothing new was ever built. That is just not true at all. This is perhaps related to the overall political and media situation of the time. It was suddenly possible to very strongly talk about the unfortunate state of things. Politicians, of course, like to over-exaggerate their plans and establish impossible deadlines for all sorts of construction projects. So it's then very easy to point out their failures to the public, which suddenly was a big contrast to the previous times. So it suddenly seemed in media that everything is just terrible and, nothing goes according to plan. But anyways, those were the highways. Let's now talk about what I'm building down here in the city. Alright, so I started building that second entrance into the city for this first city's highway, the urban highway. And over here I also included these gas stations and like a resting area, highway rest area with McDonald's and a casino. Now that casino, that's actually supposed to be heavily inspired by the casino in the German Gotha city. It's actually exactly like this. It's a glass pyramid that's just looking very 90s. So I had a metro station that had this sort of shape. Unfortunately, I cannot convert it into procedural object, so it is a metro station there, just straight out of the box, and and I just, included that casino sign, and that's it. That McDonald's, I just detailed it lightly all around, did some parking lots, and yeah, it was done. Not much else to it. Now, a couple of technical things to mention. At first, I wanted to build all of this with the pack from Workshop, the Highway Over Wall, which is very nice pack of highways. Unfortunately, one really bad thing about it is that it has a lot that's not looking very good at all. It has this like a white outline that's very visible on the transition, so I decided to not use it, which was probably a good thing because I just switched back to my custom roads that I was even using for the urban highway. The problem with these is that, as you can see, I have to do all the intersection markings everywhere, which takes a long time, but the result is much more customized. And eventually I am going to do, you will even see that over here, even though this interchange is not going to be all that huge, there are some heavily customized pieces or connections that would not really be possible with the standard ways. So it's just much easier to do it with the nodeless approach, just align the networks perfectly to each other, which is, by the way, the reason why I made these custom networks for myself, because I paid attention to have all the lanes exactly the same width and everything, so I can do these sorts of, compatibilities, that sort of thing. So, the techniques that I'm using over here for this, you can see. Anyways, so that's the first technical thing. Second, yeah, I know that I was using some manual, ancient technique for placing the chevrons on the connections of the highways. I know intersection marking tools exist. Obviously, I'm using it right here, but that particular style of the chevron is not possible with IMT, and also IMT doesn't do very well like transitions between different segments, so that the chevrons are like compatible between different segments, So I'd much rather do it manually there to have it nice. The third thing, oh yeah, I made those gas stations kind of functional because long time ago, I remember watching a tutorial made by the Sheik, and he was making, I think it was a truck stop or maybe a gas station as well. I don't remember. And he was exactly using that technique of, I don't know if it was invisible highways or some sort of different roads, but you basically need to make an intersection at the desired stop at the gas pump, for example, and you have to put a stop sign over there so that the vehicles actually stop. Unfortunately, you won't see that in the cinematics because I really don't know how to, nicely, not really forcibly make some cars go into the gas station to actually use that path. So yeah, everyone is obviously using the straight connection over the highway. So that's unfortunate. I tried, but hey, it didn't work. Anyways, that's the first location. Now, by the way, oh yeah, the first location, it was partially built over a bridge because there's like a valley, which you will actually see in the next episode that there is a valley. No spoilers though. Then it continues into a highway, a tunnel, and just off the map somewhere. Now we are on the second, the other side of the city for the second entrance to this already finished entrance to the urban highway. And here I made a very simple interchange, which looks like it's not exactly making sense right now, but that's because this interchange is going to be much bigger. And right now I'm just building one part of it. That's actually something that was done in real life on a couple of interchanges where it was clear that there is going to be some different connection, later, but it wasn't planned just yet. It wasn't financed just yet, but the previous projects are obviously already including it somehow. So all sorts of like prepared ramps and those kinds of things. And obviously space left for those future projects. So that's the second part that I did there. And I also did like a construction site of a new highway bridge over the river, which is that first part of the highway ring around the city. So at first I wanted to build those highway rings already a little, but as you could have seen in real life, there weren't that many of them. There were partial rings, more like 1/5 of the total ring around Budapest, built in the 90s. Berlin already had the ring highway, but it already had it, decades earlier. But the other capital cities of the region did not really get that just yet. So that would be a project for later. And obviously the cities in Central Europe are heavily struggling with these kinds of bypass roads even today. So it's not something that we will deal with in a single project, in a single episode. This interchange right here is just an entrance to that new prefab area from the 70s, the new city kind of. And it's just, this highway, this urban highway is going to have many more of these city entrances. And of course, the rings are going to have many, many more interchanges around the city. So I don't really want to build anything super complicated at this point because these entrances don't really need that. But don't worry, later we will build something crazier for sure. All right, so this is the second project. The transition did not really show massive change, but obviously something happened over there, and it's mostly just the preparation for some future stuff. So I did not really want to over detail this construction site because it's of course only done for this cinematic, and well, it's going to be complete. The highway is going to be complete in some future projects. Yeah, I did make car restrictions on those roads, but for some reason, as you could have seen, there is still some traffic going to the construction site. Maybe it's just like delivery of materials or something like that. Well, anyways, this was episode 96. The next episode is going to be episode 97, which means that, there was something happening in 1997 in Central Europe, certain natural events. So we are going to cover that as well. Anyways, that is going to be all for today's episode. Thank you so much for watching it. Hope you liked it. If you did, then please do all the things below the video, all the writing, clicking, subscribing, and big thanks to channel members who are directly supporting this channel and me in what I'm doing. I highly appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. Goodbye.